COVID emergency orders are among the greatest intrusion on civil liberties, says Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch. The Supreme Court got rid of a pandemic-related immigration case with a single sentence. Justice Neil Gorsuch had a lot more to say, leveling harsh criticisms of how governments, from small towns to the nation's capital, responded to the gravest public health threat in a century. The justice, a 55-year-old conservative who was President Trump's first Supreme Court nominee, called emergency measures taken during COVID-19 crisis that killed more than 1 million Americans perhaps the greatest intrusions on civil liberties in peacetime history of this country. He pointed to orders of closing schools, which we were against at this show, and people called us all kinds of names for it. People said we were anti-teacher and anti-union because we were for keeping schools open, and that was the right policy. And none of those people ever apologized or acknowledged that they were wrong. But they did bulk delete their tweets from the last 2 years. People, closing schools, restricting church services, mandating vaccines, and prohibiting evictions. His broadside was aimed at local, state, and federal officials, even his colleagues. Executive officials across the country issued emergency decrees on a breathtaking scale. He wrote in an 8-page statement Thursday that accompanied an expected Supreme Court order formally dismissing a case involving the use of Title 42 policy to prevent asylum seekers from entering the United States. The policy was extended last week with the expiration of the public health emergency first declared more than 3 years ago because of the coronavirus pandemic.
The policy was ended. You said extended.
I'm sorry. The policy was ended. That's what I meant to say. The policy was ended last week with the expiration of the public health emergency first declared. So they ended the COVID. We're no longer in emergency. We're no longer in emergency. And when the Omicron variant surged in late 2021 and early 2022, Gorsuch was the lone justice to appear in the courtroom unmasked, even as his seatmate, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who has diabetes, reportedly did not feel safe in close quarters with people who were not wearing masks. That's because Sonia Sotomayor doesn't know anything about the science around masks or COVID. That would be why. So she's responding out of ignorance and fear the way most of the people did around COVID. She was 100% wrong. He was 100% right. The emergency orders about which Gorsuch complained were first announced in the early days of the pandemic when Trump was president and months before the virus was well understood and a vaccine was developed. With Gorsuch and 5 other conservatives in the majority, they ended the eviction moratorium and blocked a Biden administration plan to require workers at large companies to be vaccinated or wear a mask and submit to regular testing. Once Amy Coney Barrett joined the court after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, they ended restrictions on religious services in some areas. By a 5-4 vote, from which Gorsuch and 3 conservative colleagues dissented, the court allowed the administration to require many healthcare workers to be vaccinated. But on Thursday, Gorsuch gathered his complaints in one place, writing about the lessons he hoped might be learned from the past 3 years. One lesson might be this: fear and the desire for safety are powerful forces. They can lead to a clamor for action, almost any action, as long as someone does something to address a perceived threat. A leader or an expert who claims he can fix everything, if only we do exactly as he says, can prove an irresistible force. Another possible lesson, he wrote, the concentration of power in the hands of so few may be efficient and sometimes unpopular, but it does not tend toward sound government. He's right about that. He also had strong words for the Republican-led states that tried to keep the Title 42 policy in place, and look up Title 42.
Okay.
And the 5 conservative justices whose votes extended the policy 5 months beyond when it would have otherwise ended in late December.
Title 42.
So Title 42 allowed the government to refuse asylum and turn away migrants. So used to be you could come here and then apply for asylum and then they decide if you get it. But Title 42, you couldn't come in and you had to stay in Mexico. And that was on the grounds of preventing COVID. That's why they did that. The policy was adopted by Trump administration in 2020, and they just got rid of it now because the emergency COVID thing was over. At the very least, one can hope that the judiciary will not soon again allow itself to be part of the problem by permitting litigants to manipulate our docket to perpetuate a decree designed for one emergency to address another. So he's saying the mixing of the COVID emergency with the immigration emergency. In the final paragraph of his statement, Gorsuch acknowledged, but only grudgingly, that emergency orders sometimes are necessary. Make no mistake, decisive executive action is sometimes necessary and appropriate, but if emergency decrees promise to solve some problems, they threaten to generate others. And here we go. In a scathing statement, Justice Gorsuch described COVID restrictions as possibly the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in the peacetime history of this country. He recognized that government pressured social media companies to suppress information about pandemic policies. So it says threatened to fire non-compliant employees and warned that service members who refuse to vaccinate might face dishonorable discharge and confinement. Along the way, it seems, federal officials may have pressured social media companies to suppress information about pandemic policies with which they disagreed. Of course that happened if you know anything about the Twitter files. Anyway, good for Neil Gorsuch. He's right. He's right. So that's all I can say. Check out my new stand-up special, COVID Lies Are Funny, at jimmydore.com. Only $10. Become a premium member. We're going to be on tour in Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, California, Baltimore, Maryland, and San Francisco, California. Plus, did we say Chicago? There's lots of stuff. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. See you there.